Hi everyone. My name is Amina. I am representing Concern, and I'll be presenting about the Concern's cash transfers in the slums of Nairobi. Just to take you a little, I'll just give you an outline of my presentation. I'll give a bit of a background on the urban situation in Kenya, talk about the vulnerabilities, the responses or initiatives that have been taken in the past that are specifically geared towards the urban population, and the Korogocho initiative, which is the initiative that Concern undertook in the slums, and also take you through the impact based on an evaluation carried out in 2011 and some of the lessons learned coming out of the initiative, and then briefly talk about our engagement with the government of Kenya and how they've been able to take the lessons learned as well as the model that we had in Korogocho forward. So a bit of background. The program was implemented in Nairobi in the slum of Korogocho. Nairobi is a really fast-growing city. The annual growth of Nairobi is estimated at 1.2%, and we have currently the population of Nairobi is estimated to be slightly over 4 million, of which 60% of that population lives in informal settlements or slums. And based on a World Bank study done in 2006, 70 to 75% of the population living in the slums are considered to be living below the poverty line compared to the national figure of 46% at that time. So clearly there are several issues in the urban slums or in the urban context in terms of poverty and vulnerability. Because of being in an urban place, there are multiple vulnerabilities that the poor experience. One is their high dependence on markets for sustenance. Secondly, high dependence on markets simply because they don't produce food. I mean, it's an urban place, so there's no much urban agriculture going on, and even when you look at the context in the slums, there's no space to even have a small kitchen garden. But I will talk about some of the initiatives that have taken place to try and address some of these issues. And then, of course, Kenya in the past 10 years has kind of experienced frequent droughts. The cycles of the droughts are becoming shorter and shorter. We moved from a 5-year cycle to almost a 2.5-year cycle. Of course, part of it has to do with climate change, but a good part of it has to do with how, as a country, we manage disaster preparedness and response. And then, of course, we are not, Nairobi is not in a bubble. A lot of the things that affect the global food prices tend to be translated to the population living in the slums in a much higher intensity than the average population, the other parts of Nairobi. And then, of course, that is exacerbated by the poor access to basic services. You've got very limited health facilities, very limited water and sanitation facilities, education facilities, and of course, these have an impact on not just the current generation, but also the future generations living in the slums in terms of their access to labor markets, employment, and other livelihood opportunities. By the fact that they're living in the slums, of course, these are people who've migrated from their original homes. They are cut off from the normal traditional safety net system. So their coping strategies in terms of shocks is weakened because of having been removed from the traditional setup. And you would find that living in the slums, people tend to keep to themselves. they tend to keep to themselves. Yes, there is an element of sharing, but it's not the same as in the rural areas. There's an element of support, but it's not the same in the rural areas because everybody is dealing with the same issues. So I can support you today and tomorrow, but that's how far I can go because I'm equally stretched. We are more or less on the same level. And then, of course, there's the issue of crime and violence. Korogocho is, like any other slum, prone to crime, prone to violence, and that has an impact on people's livelihood strategies. It has an impact on people's businesses. It has an impact on the timings that people can go out and work, on the timings that people can access markets. So it's a number of issues that layer up to make them more and more vulnerable. To look at the vulnerabilities that exist and what has been happening in the slums to try and address these vulnerabilities from the government perspective, because the government has the responsibilities to address some of these issues. Of course, as NGOs, we come in to support and fill in gaps where government isn't able to, particularly in the context of Kenya, where you have a functioning government. The government's efforts until, I must say, 5 years ago have been mostly focusing on the rural areas. I think there was this thinking that if we address the problem of poverty in the rural areas, then we would be able to contain the issue of rural-urban migration that has caused, in the eyes of the government, that has caused the existence of some of these slums. And until recently, the government did not acknowledge some of these slums. And I think the issue of acknowledgement is still there because when you look at basic services, government is not ready and willing to invest inside these settlements. The basic services that are there are on the outskirts, and they would not be mostly the people living in the slums would not benefit from those services, those public services. And then, of course, there have been several government initiatives to try and address issues of food security. Like I said, these have mostly been in the slums, in rural areas, sorry, and in instances where they did target the urban areas, I think the policy was a fail. One of the cases in mind is the maize subsidy policy, which was introduced as a result of the global food spikes in 2008, 2009 to try and make maize more accessible to the poor. This was not implemented the way it had been thought out. It was meant to be subsidized in certain areas of the city, but of course there was a lot of corruption around it. There was seepage, and very little really got to the parts of the city that were meant to benefit from this. So the government started thinking of, okay, this has failed. We will not be able to address we would not be able to address the issue of food insecurity in the slums. Let's just focus on the rural areas where we have programs that are existing. And I must say that most of the government social protection programs, which tend to address mostly food security and other chronic vulnerabilities, are implemented in the rural areas. But we were just coming, the 2008-2009 period was a very difficult period for Kenya. We had just come out of the post-election violence. Of course, the places that really flared up were, aside from the Rift Valley, was Nairobi. Nairobi was like one of the places that also flared up, and a lot of the action was in the slums. So it kind of forced the government to start thinking of what can we do to address the situation in the slums. And the government started reaching out to organizations that have been working in the slums and have had or have a successful ongoing programs in the slums addressing livelihoods and other issues. And Concern and Oxfam were one of the two organizations that were approached to come and join a task force that would look into food insecurity issues. And I think before that invitation, as an organization, we had also just done a study in the slums of Nairobi and Kisumu, trying to highlight the food insecurity issues and what implications it was having in terms of the malnutrition rates, in terms of, the increase in negative coping strategies. And that is all based on a situation where, people had just come out of a conflict situation, trying to pick up their lives, and here they are, food prices are high, no jobs, and the risk that would, and the consequences of that in the immediate term. So a task force was set up to look at what are the other ways that can be used to address, and of course the most appropriate measure considered at that time was a cash transfer measure, given that the markets had picked up, the infrastructure was there, and that's one of the beauties of working in an urban area. You have the infrastructure to deliver the cash. You had organizations that had prior experience, and in this case was Concern. I must say that Concern was the first organization in Kenya to utilize cash transfers in the urban slum using mobile money transfer mechanism. So the infrastructure was there, an organization with the experience was there, and like I said, the markets were functioning, so it would, putting in cash would not bring in the challenges of where will the food be available, and so on and so forth. So the Korogocho initiative was then implemented. As I said, this initiative was implemented as a response to the food security crisis in 2008, 2009. The immediate objective for the initiative was to meet the basic food needs of the slum dwellers, particularly vulnerable households, but also try and look at how we can link this to longer-term recovery and development initiatives. The population living in the urban slums are population that are dealing with chronic vulnerabilities. I talked of not just their high dependence on markets and the issue of drought, but these are people who have no access to basic services. These are people who have no access to employment. You have an employment rate of over 40% in the slums, and that varies amongst the women and the youth is close to 60%. So you're talking of chronic vulnerabilities, and a 3 to 6 month cash transfer to deal with the food issue would not help them overcome some of these issues. And so we felt that we needed to look at how we can make that link within this initiative. So the initiative had 3 components. It had a cash transfer component, it had a livelihood development component, and had what we call a social transformation component, which is a component that tries to get communities to talk about their problems and take collective actions in addressing some of these problems as their own, as themselves, or by trying to engage in collective lobbying efforts to get the government to address some of these problems. The design of the initiative did incorporate GOK's recommendations, because the whole idea was we do this as a pilot, and then the government of Kenya takes it over and expands it to other slums, not just within Nairobi, but also in Kisumu and Mombasa, which are the other 2 main cities in Kenya. The government, one of the issues that they had was of having a fixed transfer and not indexing the transfers to the market conditions or the food prices. Our previous experience has been, in our previous experience we were working on the basis of indexing the cash transfers. Of course, it's much more useful to the beneficiaries because it helps them meet their needs according to the market prices, but then it's also very complicated in terms of budgeting, in terms of also from an accountability perspective. We had a situation where beneficiaries would not know how much money they were to expect next month, so planning became very difficult for them. This month they would receive 4,500. The next month they would receive 3,000 shillings simply because prices had dropped. So the government preferred that we didn't index, but just had a fixed transfer amount, which at that time was around $25. The cash transfer phase was implemented for an 8-month period, and within Korogocho we targeted about 2,300. Oxfam targeted about 3,000 in another slum. So in Nairobi, the total coverage is about 5,300 for that pilot phase of 8 months. We did do an evaluation at the end of the 8th month, but the evaluation was done 3 months after the end of the 8th month. And some of the findings were quite positive in the sense that when you look at the food consumption score, there was an increase from 1.61 at the time of baseline to 2.53, 3 months after the end of the transfer. The household dietary diversity also increased from 3.4 to 7.7, and this is again 3 months after the end of the transfer. Of course, in terms of the dietary diversity, yes, they did expand the food items consumed, but most of them did not expand the food groups. So if it was carbs, probably people included rice, pasta in their meals, but didn't go for, let's say, proteins, didn't go for different types of proteins. So that for us was a lesson in the sense that if we are to do cash transfers looking at food security, we needed to have a nutritional education component that goes hand in hand with it so that you have the intended nutritional benefits in the end of the intervention. Then there was an increase in the purchase of goods with 60% of the transfers being spent on the purchase of food and non-food items. The other 40% of the transfer was mostly spent on other household costs or expenditures like rent, like school fees, like healthcare, transport for maybe the head of the household to go to work or to visit a health clinic. So 60% of it was spent on the purchase of food and non-food items. From the evaluation, 95% of the beneficiaries reported to have spent the money on what it was intended for, that is for food and other household needs. Of course, there would be a few instances where people, a household, maybe the man or even the woman decided, well, 2,000 shillings has come into my account, this is the time for me to go and party or go and drink up. Those cases were there, but it's not to say that it was it was a very small proportion of the beneficiaries that had those issues. Now, the other thing that we realized during that period was it helped stimulate the markets. You had lots of beneficiaries engaging in small trade, but also you had, because of the purchasing power increasing amongst the beneficiaries, you had traders who are already in business trying to diversify the products that they bring because of this demand for different products, for better quality products, simply because people had purchasing power at that time. We didn't do a detailed study on the inflationary effects of the cash transfer, but anecdotal reports from the traders, from the beneficiaries themselves, and from other members of the community gave the result that there was very insignificant inflationary effects on the local market. Prices remained more or less stable during that time. Of course, beneficiaries felt they had more variety because they could go to different shopkeepers and get different things at different prices. So for them, it was a good thing. Of course, the fact that we had an increase in the food consumption and an increase in the dietary diversity just goes to show that food intake enhanced was up, and of course this had a result of enhancing productivity amongst beneficiaries. A good cohort of the people that we supported during that time were people who were HIV positive and were on ARVs, and at that time, because of not being able to access food, some of them were actually bedridden. And it was it was very good to see that 8 months down the line, these people were out of bed, they were out there working, either being employed within the informal sector, or having set up their own businesses to make a living out of. And then 75% of the beneficiaries invested part of their transfers into small businesses. But of course, this was only possible for households that had a lower dependency ratio. Households that had a high dependency ratio were not able to invest because, $25 was barely enough, was not even enough to meet their food needs. Some of them, when interviewed, talked of having gone through the money in less than 2 weeks, given that they only had one breadwinner, and you're talking of a household of maybe 9 or 10 or even 12 people, depending on one breadwinner and the additional income of 2,000 shillings. Some things were only possible for households that had a lower dependency ratio, and these households were able to sustain their well-being for a relatively higher period after the transfer. But for households that had a higher dependency ratio, the well-being of the households kind of went back to where it was 4 months after. From a transformational point of view, there was an improvement in the confidence of the beneficiaries. They felt that this steady income gave their households a certain confidence to participate in community fora, to raise questions. Most of them actually abandoned their negative coping strategies, so there was a drop in the adoption of negative coping strategy 3 months after the end of the transfer, but also of women, men who were previously engaged in illegal activities, saying we've quit this because we've been able to set up a small business. I've quit this because I managed to get a job, I managed to stay focused on my life, and go out and search, because that extra 2,000 shillings gave me the breathing space to try and look for work. Targeting, we did a community-based targeting. It was very complex, but I can say that community-based targeting can take place in the urban areas, and maybe this is something we can talk about in the question and answer session. I can explore more how the targeting was done. But one of the things that we found to be very useful was the inclusion of the complaints and response mechanisms as part of the response. This helped us minimize inclusion errors. We continued, even during that period of implementation, we continued to engage the government. We regularly and frequently presented our monitoring results, the post-distribution monitoring. What are we seeing? How are people spending their money? Because this was a main issue for the government. We cannot give people in urban areas money because, 1, they will drink it all. 2, it will make them lazy. This is what some of the people thought, some of the key decision makers in government thought, that if we give them money, this would make them lazy. But the post-distribution monitoring that was being done was actually showing the contrary, that yeah, people are actually spending the money on what they should be doing. And despite getting 2,000 a month, you still had the breadwinner going out to work every day. So it wasn't like, here is money, we sit back and not do anything. So this was a very positive, because now we got policy. The government started to get more and more interested in it. They approached different donors, one of them being the government of Japan, to support this program in the urban areas. And fortunately enough, the government of Japan did provide some funding towards that. It was great. The government was thinking of implementing this in the urban areas, but for us we felt, okay, this needs to be anchored on some policy framework. It cannot just be based on a technocrat who thinks that this is something that they can do because they're there. And started supporting civil society network to push for a legal and policy framework for the implementation of such initiatives in the urban slums within a broader social protection framework. Within 2 years from that initiative, the government adopted the same model for implementation in Mombasa. And Concern was requested by the government to provide support in the monitoring of that initiative in Mombasa. So we did provide support in the monitoring of that initiative in Mombasa. We reviewed the government's targeting mechanisms and provided some recommendations which have contributed to the streamlining of the government's safety net programs. But we've also been trying to provide support for public awareness on safety nets and social assistance in the urban context, because there is still this feeling that it's okay to support people in the rural areas, but it's not okay to support people in the urban areas, because people feel that if you're in the urban areas, you should be able to work. There are opportunities. You should be able to take advantage of these opportunities. But of course, we know that not everybody has the same access to these opportunities. How much opportunities you have access to is dependent on a number of things, including your social economic status. And we felt that having an initiative that tries to provide that safety net, that tries to uplift some of these households in the urban slums would contribute to them being able to make or to take advantage of the opportunities that exist in the urban areas. And of course, when you look at it from the time of our engagement and the time of supporting the various civil society networks, there has been a slight increase in the government's budgetary allocation. And of course, for us, it's a great progress that the urban food subsidy program now features in the government's budgetary allocation. Previously, it didn't feature, and it came through either donor funding or from NGO funding, but now it features in the government's budgetary allocations. That's the initiative in a nutshell. I'm happy to take questions and answers at the next session.
Thank you so much, Amina, for your presentation. And I just wanted to remind everyone that if you have any questions, you are welcome to submit them, either specific questions for either of our presenters or wider discussion questions. And any questions that we don't get to within the time frame of today, we will ask our presenters to follow up with, both with the question asker and also in our urban response community of practice. So our next presenter is going to be Tim Forster from Oxfam. All right, I think we're having just a few technical difficulties getting Tim on the line. Just while Tim gets started, I will just start with a question for Amina that came in. That question is, if functioning markets are a condition for successful cash transfer programs, then at what point can it be said that this is the case? For instance, in the Philippines today, at what point do you recommend that cash distributions could be started? So I wonder, Amina, if you have any thoughts on that question.
I honestly believe that functioning, of course, the functionality, it doesn't have to be 100% functional, but I think what you need to look at is the availability of the goods. If you're looking at providing cash, let's say for food specifically, you need to look at whether these foods are available and how many vendors are actually out there selling these food items.
Hi, Amina. I think that we've got, sorry, I think Tim's audio is just kicked in. Tim, while you're loading your presentation, Amina can just finish up answering the question she was answering. Sorry, Amina.
No problem, no problem. So as I was saying, I think the functionality would vary. For me, what I would think would be most essential is to look at the availability of the items that you're thinking the cash transfers should go towards supporting. If it's food, need to look at the availability of the food at the locally. How many vendors are there? If you don't have much vendors, are there people that are ready and willing to bring in that food and sell? Because you also don't want to find yourself in a situation where you're now trying to control the market prices. Market prices need to, the market needs to control itself. So the more you have people that are able to deal or to provide the goods that you're looking at, the better for you, but also for the beneficiaries in terms of the pricing. We've done this in the ASOs in areas where people initially thought, no way, you guys cannot be doing cash transfers. But it has worked, and the key for us has been, is there a vendor in that area? Or is there somebody that is ready and willing to come in to this area? Or is there somebody locally that has the potential to bring in? I mean, sometimes it might even mean, and I would think in the case of the Philippines, trying to get somebody from a different town to bring in the goods and selling. So I would say right now might not be the best time to do a cash transfer in the Philippines, but maybe in 2-3 weeks time when people start picking themselves up and you have the spirit, the spirit of entrepreneurship is there in Philippines, but you have people that are ready, that see the opportunity in the response, opportunity in the good sense, not to try and rip people off.
So yes, this presentation is about some activities that Oxfam did in terms of wash and vouchers in the Gaza Strip. Now, for those of you who don't know the Gaza Strip, it's a very small territory that's enclosed by the sea on one side and Egypt in the south and Israel around the other borders. Very narrow, and there are a lot of people who live there. Now, one of the characteristics of the Gaza Strip is that water quality or access to water is very difficult. Most of the water comes from an aquifer below the city or below the strip, and the aquifer is highly contaminated, mainly because of chemical contamination, because it's over pumped essentially, and there's also a lot of saline intrusion. Now, there is a municipal water supply, and that water supply in general is considered to be very poor quality. So people access water generally through water vendors who've obtained their supplies from producers who use reverse osmosis to improve the quality. Now, the quality of that water, when it's been through the reverse osmosis, is a lot better chemically, but unfortunately it's not always treated in terms of any chlorination. So the risk of recontamination through bacteria and other things can be very high. Because of this problem of water quality, Oxfam decided to work with vouchers to try and target people living in poor communities in parts of Gaza City. So this is a particular project. It was with ECHO, which is the European Community Humanitarian Office. It was financed by them. Oxfam basically recognises all humanitarian responses need to consider markets when they're being implemented, and where it's possible to use those markets because it can make the response more appropriate and more cost effective. Now, as I mentioned in Gaza, water is very often from water vendors because that is the main means of getting better quality drinking water to the population. And maybe just to add that Oxfam has a number of experiences using cash and or market-based solutions to wash. This has happened in Haiti, where a water market survey was done during the earthquake response. Jijiga, which is in Ethiopia, where again water is supplied to the community by the private sector, and there an emergency market analysis was undertaken to see how the private sector could be used. A similar thing in Wajir, Kenya, which is another area where water is supplied to communities through the private sector. And another thing we're currently looking at, starting, is supplying chlorine solution through the private sector to people in the region of the Great Lakes. The idea being this chlorine can be used to improve water quality at the household level. And again, a similar thing in Amman, Jordan, where we've looked at links between the private sector and trying to give water to refugee communities who have come from Syria. Yeah? So these are just some of the experiences where Oxfam has worked with WASH and markets. As I mentioned in Gaza, the situation in terms of water for drinking at the household level, it generally comes from the private sector, reverse osmosis, and it comes through a number of water vendors. This market tends to be unregulated. So you have people who produce the water, and then that water will be distributed by tankers, or it will be sent to specific locations within the community where people can go and buy the quantity that they would need for their family. Yeah? So in 2011, as part of the ECHO project that Oxfam started in Gaza, an assessment was conducted in Gaza City and areas around, and it was found that a very high number of people consume poor quality water. So this was visiting households to take samples to find out what people were doing in terms of water. So 76% of the people surveyed were found to be using water which was contaminated in some way. This could either be chemical contamination, so water directly from the aquifer that hadn't been purified properly. There was contamination through handling, and so there were bacteria back in the water. Or it was physically contaminated through the types of handling or the containers that people were using. So that seemed to be the situation, the baseline that we found. So the project itself was set up with the Palestinian Water Authority. So this is the regulatory body for water supply in Palestine. And a pilot project was set up of around 700 households. Now, the pilot project was to use vouchers to try to improve access to better quality water for poor communities in Gaza. Now, possibly I should just add there that a lot of the communities in Gaza are poor because of the blockade. I should just add, just trying to find the poor communities, or it was very difficult to target them because on the whole, the communities we looked at were generally poor. So it was very difficult to differentiate between those who were extremely poor and those who were poor. So that was one of the very big problems that we had. And we looked at 3 communities: Al-Malhala, Al-Mulgragha, and Al-Zaga. Yeah? So we looked at 700 households, and the object of the project was to try and reduce water-related diseases because of people accessing poor quality water. What Oxfam did, they worked with a local partner, YEC, and we set up basically a local committee to steer the project and to also provide transparency and encourage the participation of local community-based organisations. And the committee was involved at various stages of the project. So that would also be the producers, the people who transport it to different sites, and also the communities themselves. So we have a mix of key stakeholders. One of the main problems with setting up the project was the targeting, as I mentioned. Firstly, it was difficult to define what the criteria in terms of poverty were to identify who could be included in the project. There were also politics involved in targeting the area because there are different political factions that may live in different parts of a neighbourhood. And then some of the communities are Bedouin, and very often we don't have clear census of those communities, so we're not really sure how many people are there. So overall, trying to target the communities that really needed the assistance most from this particular project was very, very challenging. And ultimately what the project decided to do was to go for blanket coverage in specific areas. So that means that everybody in these specific areas which were targeted were able to access the project and vouchers. And I think that's one of the key lessons, is when you're setting up a project like this, you need to have good needs assessments, very appropriate objectives, and be able to include the target group in the methodology from the start. Essentially, this was based around vouchers. So the community in the project target area got vouchers. The main counterparts who were providing the water were the trucks that came to these particular areas to deliver water to households. So essentially the communities, using the vouchers that were provided, were able to access water from the trucks that normally service this area. And what Oxfam did, they did a lot of upstream control around water quality. So the people who were coming to this area, we were checking that the production of the water was being done correctly, that it was being treated when it was leaving the reverse osmosis plant, and then that it was handled correctly from that plant right down to the delivery level in the community. Yeah. And the overall satisfaction of the beneficiaries in terms of the amount of water and the quality of water which they got through this process, the majority of the people, 84%, were very happy with what they got, essentially. And there was a lot of monitoring and accounting during the project to make sure, as I say, not only the water quality, but make sure that the vouchers are being used correctly and not being misused, and just to make sure that the whole project was functioning correctly. So different controls at different parts of the project that ensured the project was on track. Yeah? Now, just to say, this process was very manual. There were sort of vouchers changing hands, and vouchers when they were being collected, all of this was manual. There was no electronic mechanisms used in the project to try and keep track of all these transactions. There was some thought about doing this, but it was considered that manual checking would be the best approach. The key lessons that we learned from this exercise, I guess one of the first things, trying to target vulnerable communities in the Gaza Strip was extremely challenging, as I've mentioned earlier. Possibly when we set up the project, we didn't fully understand the economic factors that impacted on this particular project, and that's something that if we did it again, we would need to fully integrate into the activity. We didn't have enough suppliers coming to the particular areas where we worked. Now, we limited our interaction with 2 local companies, and ideally, to make this a better, stronger project, we'd like to interact with more companies. I would just add that companies can be the producers of the water and the suppliers of the water. There may be independent truckers who actually also supply in these areas, and I don't think we had a large enough range of suppliers to these particular project areas. And we tried to get the community water resellers involved in this. Now, a community water reseller, if you want to think about it, is more like a shop or a place in the community where they have a big tank. The water is delivered by tanker to these specific tanks, and then people will come around from their neighborhood to this particular point to collect the water in jerry cans. Now, for some reason, the community water resellers pulled out of the initiative and didn't support it. So more would be needed done to keep these people on board in future. Yeah? And I think what really came out of this project was that we need to understand the market for water in Gaza better. So this is the whole chain from the producer right down to the consumer, and including all of the stages in between, which would be the water tankers or the community water sellers. So that's one of the things that we concluded from this particular project. And just recently, a fuller market study was undertaken in Gaza to try and address some of these questions. These are the key points from the market analysis, which took place only last month in October. Firstly, there was a problem with the amount of containers that people had at the household level. So there's a need for people to have access to more containers, especially in neighborhoods which get very poor service coverage. So increasing people's ability to store water at home is one of the things that we need to take on board. One thing that Oxfam has been focusing on since we undertook this activity is to work with neighbourhood-based water safety plans. So this is analysing the chain from the producers right down to the consumer, with all the different handling stages in between, to see how all of the key stakeholders involved can play a role in trying to guarantee the quality of the water, to make sure it's affordable and the quality is good when it actually reaches the household and is consumed by people. And another thing is to work more with the independent water tanker drivers. During our project, that's one of the things we didn't integrate fully. As I mentioned earlier, we didn't have enough suppliers, and I think we need to have more independent water tanker drivers involved if we did this in the future. Yeah? And possibly some of those people involved in transporting the water to the neighbourhood level or to the community level, we may need to support some of them to be able to do their job better. So maybe supplying fuel vouchers, making sure people have access to chemicals for disinfecting water, and maybe more appropriate technologies. So there's more to be done in terms of support to the people transporting the water. So that's it. Can the private water sector meet the needs of poor and very poor communities during conflicts? I think the answer is yes, but I think we need to understand the dynamics a lot better. We need to understand the incentives that make the market chain work. So that's from production right down to where we sell the water. And then we need to understand the activities that we do, how these impact on getting water to people where they need it and at the right quality. Sorry, they're testing the fire alarm. So these are some of the key things. Just some conclusions and recommendations for doing urban water voucher programs in the future. One thing that we noticed that during conflicts in Gaza, when it flares up, that water tanker drivers still continue to operate even in a conflict setting. So even though there's conflict going on, water tankers will still get out and about, maybe a little bit less, to the people to provide the drinking water they need. Generally, this water infrastructure that exists in Gaza, it survived many conflicts with Israel, and if it's not directly damaged by military activities, it continues to work. So even in times of conflict, this will continue to work. And it's the same with the water distribution. The trucks will continue, and the only thing which really may affect that is the availability of diesel fuel. During a conflict, people may be liable to use higher risk water sources. And if that's the case, then they of course become more open to waterborne diseases and other public health risks. Another thing we found, people do not like water which is too heavily chlorinated. So getting the dosage of chlorine for disinfection correct is crucial to making such an activity work. The chlorine is crucial to avoid recontamination of water, but if you get too much in, then people no longer like the taste or the smell. So getting that part right and working with the supply chain is crucial. And more needs to be done to improve the regulatory framework in Gaza. A lot of the agencies involved in regulation don't have the resources to do their job properly even if they have the specified standards and procedures in place. And very often water supply can rely very much on the INGO, UN and other sort of charitable organisations to get water to where it's needed most. Anyway, that's conclusions and recommendations based on this experience from Gaza, and I guess now we will open that up to questions.
That's right, Tim. A big thank you to both of our presenters and to everyone who's still on the line with us. Since we had some technical difficulties, we're going to keep going for another 20 minutes or so if everyone's okay. If you do have to leave because you've got other commitments, remember that the webinar will be recorded and you can watch the question and answer session or listen to it as it were later on. And any questions that we don't get to, we will address in our Urban Response Community of Practice. So a lot of specific questions have come in for both Amina and Tim, but I wonder if we could start off with one more general. The first question I want to think about is, for both Tim and Amina, what guidance materials were used when you were designing the programs, and what gaps did you notice in guidance and learning specific to urban and cash programs? So either Amina or Tim, whoever's ready to get started.
Possibly from my side, I don't know if we can call in Karen from Gaza, who was involved in the project. Would that be possible to try to get Karen to respond to these questions?
I'm afraid, Tim, that Karen has left the room, so I don't believe he's available at this time.
If I can just talk about our experiences, for us, I think our guidance was more of our experience in the post-election violence, and having been the first time where we got involved in cash transfers as a Kenya program, of course there were a lot of missteps along the way, and that formed the basis of, it formed part of our lessons, which we then used to roll out the second phase in Korogocho. But I must say that over the past few years, there's been a number of guidance documents that have come out. One that I can mention is the HPN Good Practice Review number 11 that looks at cash transfer programming in emergencies. And although this looks at cash transfer programming in emergencies, from a rural perspective, a lot of the principles are applicable to the urban context. And I think the Cash Learning Partnership website has a number of resources that, though have been developed from a rural perspective, are still applicable in the urban context with just tweaking here and there. I believe there's also some resources that they've recently posted, not recently but last year, that looks at tools for undertaking cash transfers in urban emergencies, which would be useful for people engaged in response at the moment.
Thanks for that, Amina. And we just had a comment come in from someone who's listening in that I just wanted to add in, because we have listening with us somebody who was involved in the initial design of the Gaza program, who's let us know that the guidance for that program was a mixture of information from an Oxfam Gaza food voucher program and also an ACF water trucking voucher scheme in the West Bank. There was very little information available for water vouchers in 2011. And it was mostly hygiene items in Haiti, which the lessons were from, which obviously is a very different market. So those are the guidance documents that they relied on. So thanks for adding that. That's Tracy Wise. Yes. Thank you.
Yes.
So I'll just move on to our next question, which is general, but we also did have a specific kind of spin on this that's come in for you, Tim. So in general, yes. I know, Tim, you went into targeting a bit. Perhaps, Amina, you could add a bit on how targeting was done and whether there were any specific urban challenges to targeting. And for Tim, somebody listening in wanted to know why the food voucher participants, the Oxfam had were not used for targeting in your program. So if, Amina, you want to start.
For us, I mean, targeting in the urban context is usually very challenging given the population density, and if you're working in a slum, of course, the amount of poverty, the sheer amount of poor people in that area. If you're talking of, 75% of the population being poor, and maybe the resources you have at hand is only to meet 5% of the population, it in itself is a challenge. In terms of the time frame, it took us more or less the same time frame that team talked about, 6 weeks, to identify beneficiaries. And like I said, for us it was a lot of learning from the previous phase, which was done during the post-election violence as a response, and we worked mostly through our partners. So during that phase, we didn't go in and identify beneficiaries. It was more of self-selection. Beneficiaries in the camps, beneficiaries that were receiving support through our local partners, and there were a lot of issues with that. But for this one, because it was a different context, we decided to apply the same principle of community-based targeting in the slum context. So what we did is divide the slums up. The slums are administratively, I'm saying administratively because that's how they themselves look at it, into villages. So pick out the villages, and within that village try and scope out, with the communities of course, where do the poorest live, and based on that try and assess households in that part of the village, hence taking quite some time. We had to work with a range of stakeholders. We had to work with the village elders, we had to work with our local partners teams, our own staff, as well as draw people from other organizations working within the area, so that we don't have an issue of manipulation going on. So for us, that is how we did the process, and then went through the verification through public meetings, posting of lists of beneficiaries in the different villages. But what I think what we found very useful was the introduction of the complaints and response mechanism. So we had awareness sessions in the various villages of what this project is about, who are the people that are to benefit. This is the criteria. Of course, the criteria had to be developed jointly with this range of stakeholders. These are the criteria, this is what people will get, and this is what it is for. And then against that, these are the people who've been selected, and that if anyone had any issues with the eligibility of these people on the list, this is the number to call, assuring them that the information they provide will be confidential, and that we will act and provide feedback on any complaint that is received with regards to the targeting. So that actually helped us identify a number of households that managed to slip through the cracks somehow, that didn't meet the criteria, which we found to be very useful. And the fact that people knew that they could call in at any point in time within that process, or even after the registration had taken place, was very useful, because then we were able to capture some of these cases earlier on in the intervention. So that's how we went about the targeting.
Great, thank you, Amina. Tim, did you want to expand a bit?
Unfortunately, I haven't been directly involved with the project in Gaza. I'm not sure why the project chose to work fully in different areas. I think there was a crossover of around 10%.
I think we're having a bit of technical issues there with Tim's line. So as he wasn't able to answer that question, maybe we'll just move on to the next one. And we have this as a general question, Amina, that we were going to discuss at a general level. That's whether there's any evidence that cash influences impact. And we were fortunate enough to get some input from CaLP before our session today. and their kind of perspective is that it seems that there's a lack of evidence and a need for definitely more documented evidence in terms of this question. However, they did say that evaluations have noted that when cash programs are done effectively, that they do stimulate early recovery, and therefore there is a positive impact. And I wonder, Amina, if you felt like there was any evidence from your program that cash did have an impact. And to add on to that, a specific question that came in from a couple of people for you was that how did you ensure that the increase in food consumption and diversification that you saw was attributable to the program and not another factor?
In terms of the impact, like I mentioned earlier, you had a proportion of the beneficiaries, I think about 25%, that were able to continue with their investments beyond the period of the transfer. And 25% might not be very significant, but given the nature of vulnerabilities that exist in this context, I think for us 25% of beneficiaries being able to continue investing is a good outcome, and we feel that it does contribute to early recovery for these beneficiaries. What has not happened is for us to go back, let's say 2-3 years later, and look at where are these beneficiaries now compared to where they are. And I think that would be a good thing if we could get a program that is able to do that, get the response, and then go back 2-3 years later and see whether that impact has been sustained beyond, like the evaluation we did the evaluation 3 months later, and of course the impact had been sustained depending on the type of the household. But then beyond the 3 months, say 12 months, 18 months, or even 24 months, is that impact sustained? We can't say that there have been signs of sustaining the impact for at least 25%, but we haven't been able to follow that up beyond the over the long term, but it has potential to create longer term impact. But this also needs to be accompanied with other complementary services, particularly basic services. This has an effect on the population's ability to withstand some of these regular shocks that they experience. So it's not just the cash, it should be cash plus to be able to sustain the impact. On the question of the food consumption score and dietary diversity, how are we able to attribute this to, how are we able to attribute this to the transfer and not other factors? Like I mentioned, we had a regular post-distribution monitoring, looking at how the consumption patterns have been in the households, and also looking at other changing factors. These households had more or less the same income throughout the period, including the 3 months after. Like I said, the prices also remained stable, probably a drop a few months, but remained more or less constant. And they were not beneficiaries of any other type of support coming in. So we felt confident enough that we could attribute this to the cash transfer.
That's great, Amina. Thanks so much. And maybe we'll just move to our final question. For both Tim and Amina, if you could just briefly maybe give us 2 points, considering the interventions that are starting up now in the Philippines and ongoing in Syria and elsewhere in the world. Do you have 1 or 2 points of advice that you'd give to people who are implementing a cash urban program similar to yours? What advice would you give? What would you do differently? Just each of you in 1 or 2 points. Tim, would you like to start? All right, let's start with Amina.
My advice would be, yes, cash is appropriate, but you have to assess your context. Like now in Philippines, like I said, well, cash might not be appropriate now, but it's probably something that the teams there could look at in the next 2 to 3 weeks, because I believe by then you'd have some of the basic infrastructure and system picking up or being put into place by the government structures. The other thing is, yes, we need to look at immediate needs. We need to look at food security needs, but also need to look at livelihoods. So as you do the cash, and this is what we did in 2011, as we started rolling out the cash, we immediately embarked on looking at measures, particularly for those families that are able to, measures of getting them into some kind of livelihood activity, not just with the cash and them making their own investments, but specifically targeting them for certain livelihood activities. So it is important that earlier on, as you try and meet the needs for today, you also start looking at livelihoods activities.
Great, thanks very much, Amina. Seems like Tim is still having some technical issues, so I think we'll call it a day for this session. Thank you again so much to both of our presenters, as well as to CaLP for working with us to organize this webinar. As noted, we will have a recording of the webinar that will be shared in the next day or two, and any questions which we didn't get addressed in the webinar we will bring into the Urban Response community of practice. I really want to encourage as well, I know that we have a lot of people listening in who really have a lot of experience themselves, and I really want to encourage anyone to send in to us any advice that you might have, or any guidance materials or lessons learned. Please do share them. You can either send them to me directly at l.campbell@alnap.org, or you can join our community of practice and share them there, because we really do want to capitalize on the experiences of everyone. As well, everyone, tomorrow you'll receive a link to give some brief feedback on the webinar, and it'll just take you a minute, and we'd love to hear your thoughts about the webinar and any potential ideas you have for future webinars. And you can also direct any questions or feedback that you might have to me, and my email should be on the screen for you there, l.campbell@alnap.org. So thank you once again for everyone joining us. We hope you have a lovely rest of your day. Goodbye for now.